Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's History Pub. My name is Karen Kinzey. I am one of the sponsors and coordinators of History Pub. We always are curious how many people might just be discovering this series. So if you have never been to History Pub before, can you raise your hand? Okay, that's quite a lot of hands. Well, welcome. We are delighted to have you here tonight. The good news is you're in the right place, and we have a great program for you. The bad news is you have been missing out on about 10 years of fantastic programs. So better late than never. You can join us here every last Monday of the month for History Pub. Just for those who are new and aren't quite familiar with the series, a little bit of background. We did start doing these programs about 10 years ago, and it's put on collaboratively by Oregon Historical Society, McMenamins, and Holy Names Heritage Center, which is my organization. You might not be as familiar with the Heritage Center, so very briefly what that is. The Sisters of the Holy Names are a order of Catholic women religious founded in Canada in 1843, who, at the request of the clergy in the Oregon area, sent 12 intrepid young women out here in 1859 to establish schools for girls, where there were very few. So they came out in 1859, kind of a gamble, and here they are these many years later. They started out with St. Mary's Academy downtown, which is still going strong. Very soon after the sisters arrived, people started to leave orphans on the doorstep, so they added that to their ministry, and then established schools up and down the West Coast, the East Coast, and today the sisters are involved in a number of things besides formal classroom education. So that includes 6 schools, a university, 4 education and literacy centers, 12 housing, so they're very interested in fair housing as well, 12 housing, peace, and service nonprofits, and 1 continuing care retirement community. The Heritage Center houses the wonderful archives of the sisters. They have been here since 1859 and have kept wonderful accounts of what was going on, not only in the places where they worked and taught, but also what was happening in local communities where they were. So for instance, we have eyewitness accounts of the Vanport flood. We have sisters who were at the deathbed of Mrs. McLaughlin, the widow of the father of Oregon, and recorded what it was like to be with her in her last moments, and a number of things relating to regional history that we have in our archives, which is located in Lake Oswego. And we also use the Heritage Center for public programming and as an affordable rental venue. So that's a little bit about us. I have some information on the back table if you would like to learn more. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Eliza Canty-Jones from OHS in just a moment, but a reminder, some of you have already dropped by the back table to contribute donations. We appreciate that. We do put the donations right back into the History Pub series so we can continue to bring you great programming. There's some information about upcoming events back there if you want to know what will be happening in the future at OHS. There's a nice listing with all kinds of things you might be interested in, so feel free to grab one of those. And also a number of you were asking what are some of our upcoming programs. So just to let you know, next month we are going to actually meet on the holiday, so hopefully some of you are free on Memorial Day and will be here with us to hear 4 people who lived at Vanport. They will talk about what it was like to live there and to experience the flood that demolished the community 70 years ago. So Vanport residents come and hear their stories firsthand next month. And again, that is the last Monday of the month. You can join us here every month for great history programming. So welcome to one and all. And now it is my pleasure to turn the podium over to Eliza, who has a few announcements about some exciting things going on at OHS, and then introduction of tonight's speaker, and we'll get right into the panel that you came to hear. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to see everyone here tonight. Thanks a lot for coming out to History Pub. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. So we do that work in a lot of ways through programs like this one, our journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, our online resources, Oregon Encyclopedia, Oregon History Project, our research library, and our museum downtown. I want to just speak a little bit about that. Our research library does not require any appointments. It's free, there's no admission, and it's open 32 hours a week to the public. So come research whatever you want to know about Oregon. Our staff is amazing and can help you find lost photographs, whatever it is you might need, we can get it for you. And so the other thing is that the museum right now, we have an exhibit that I want to make sure folks see because it's really incredible, and it's put on by the Oregon Black Pioneers. How many of you have already been to see Racing to Change, Oregon's Civil Rights Years? Excellent. And how was it? It was great, yes. Make sure you come see this. This exhibit is up just through June 24th, which is going to be here before we know it. We're open 7 days a week. Come see the exhibit. The Oregon Black Pioneers are an all-volunteer organization. This is the 4th exhibit that we've had the honor to host at OHS that they've created. And you will maybe see people you know in photographs at the exhibit. You'll definitely learn something new about the ways that Oregonians were leaders in the national civil rights movement. So come check that out. And then I also want to thank our partners. This is the last day of April. The month of April, we have been commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And the Portland NAACP chapter and the Fair Housing Council of Oregon have been our wonderful partners in a lot of great programs that we've done on this. We were able to host Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law. You can see a video of that on the OHS Facebook page if you didn't come. We had several scholars presenting new research on the history of housing discrimination here in Oregon that we presented at OHS, and we'll be publishing some of that in the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And the Fair Housing Council has been an amazing partner. They're a wonderful resource. If you're a tenant, if you're a landlord, if you know somebody who may be experiencing housing discrimination, you're just not sure, they're a great resource. So check them out and use them. And also, I want to say tonight's moderator, who I'm going to introduce, Dr. Carmen Thompson, has just been an outstanding partner with us in this project. We're really, really lucky in Portland to have Dr. Thompson here. She is a person who is deeply involved in her community. She's extremely smart in thinking as both a scholar and a public scholar, someone who understands and thinks about how to bring academic and community knowledge all together in the public sphere. And I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Thompson, for all of the wonderful work that she's done. Yeah, thank you. So don't forget, if you're a Multnomah County resident, the museum at OHS is always free to you. Thank you for that wonderful property tax support. Take advantage of it. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carmen P. Thompson, who is an adjunct instructor of Black Studies and African American History at Portland State University and at Portland Community College. Since 2009, she has taught a wide range of courses on the Black experience, including American slavery, Black feminism, and race and racism. She obtained a Master's of Arts from the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University in New York, and her PhD in U.S. History from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include the history of slavery and the slave trade in the New World and pre-colonial West Africa, early African American history, race and ethnicity in early America, and the Great Migration. And I have to brag, she's a member of the Oregon Historical Quarterly Editorial Advisory Board. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carmen Thompson and this wonderful panel.
Thank you very much, Eliza, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for coming. It's important to be out on a Monday night, so I really appreciate you taking the time. This is a wonderful event. Thank you, McMenamins, for having us here. And, you know, it's fitting, given the conversation of commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, that we would have such a conversation here at Kennedy School. So Kennedy School being kind of the epicenter of a lot of the policies and practices that made the Fair Housing Act possible, in the sense that a lot of the restrictive covenants that made Kennedy School, this area, kind of a Black neighborhood. By the way, how many of you either went to Kennedy School or know someone who went to Kennedy School? Okay, so a few of you. Right, good, good. So this is kind of home to you. But in this conversation about the Fair Housing Act and why it is that the Fair Housing Act came about because of the policies and practices that restricted where African Americans lived, in many ways, Kennedy School is exemplary of that because within a generation, it went from being primarily a white neighborhood to a black neighborhood, and then from a black neighborhood to a white neighborhood since the Fair Housing Act, right? So it makes Kennedy School an important place. So I think it's important that we're having this conversation with this as the backdrop. So, but I want tonight's event for us to be a conversation. We have our esteemed panelists here, Faye Burch, Adair, Ronnie Hartley, and Donna Harris here, who really are experts in that. They are organic intellectuals from the community who lived and experienced Portland under racial segregation in the backdrop of the Fair Housing Act. So having them here is important. So before I formally introduce them, I want to just provide a little historical context of the Fair Housing Act. And I just want to throw out this rhetorical question. Have you ever noticed that there's a black neighborhood in every city? Everywhere you go, you're like, where do black people live, right? That's no accident. Every city you go to, there is a black neighborhood. There is a place where all the black people live. And you can go and it's like, well, what side of town that they live on? It's the side of town that they live on because it's no accident, it's by purpose and design through planning, through restrictive covenants, through urban renewal practices. So this is all by design. So if you think of important, famous neighborhoods, you think of Harlem, right? Harlem didn't just become Harlem because all the black people just decided, oh, we'll just live here and make Harlem. No, this was policies and practices that made that. You think of the south side of Chicago, you think of South Central LA, you think of North and Northeast Portland, right? And all those places are iconic and vibrant. But the backdrop of that is restrictive covenants and policies and practices that restricted the access of African American people to a particular neighborhood. And these neighborhoods had particular features to them. So again, there's always a black neighborhood in some particular place, and wherever those places are, those neighborhoods are usually near a downtown, right? There's usually a freeway right near it or kind of running right through it. If you're in the South, there's the railroad tracks, right, separating that. So you have that. You also have housing projects, right? And it's like, oh, you know, those started out, you know, not necessarily being predominantly black, but part of this process of racial segregation, you had these housing projects. So you think of, many of you remember Columbia Villa before it was Columbia Villa like it is now, right? So you think of Columbia Villa, you think of the Tamaracks, right? African American people lived in these places, but they made these places home. But it was because of the racist practice of housing segregation that kind of congregated African American people in these places. But, you know, so there's this long history of that. But in spite of that, though, you see that African Americans, whether it was the housing projects, they turned these places into home, they turned them into vibrant communities. And so, but this was a policy of racial segregation, institutional racism that made it that way. And yet, African Americans, as the Bible said, turned water into wine, right? So yes, North and Northeast Portland, yes, restricted covenant, yes, Columbia Villa, and kind of congregating African American people in a certain neighborhood. African Americans still turn these places into vibrant places. So so in the same way that enslaved people took slave masters' throwaway food and turned it into the delicacies of soul food, the restrictive covenants made Harlem. Restrictive covenants then turned the Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street, it made that, right? Restrictive covenants made North and Northeast Portland what it is. So much so, ironically, that now everybody wants to live in North and Northeast, right? Alberta's hip and cool to be, Mississippi, right? We want to hang out there, isn't this hip and cool? So it's ironic that the things that the racial discrimination that turned these places into places that meant to restrict African Americans on the one hand. On the other hand, here you have it being turning itself on its head so that then people of all races want to come and live and kind of experience, you know, a Harlem, a North and Northeast Portland, the diversity and the vibrancy of these communities. And in the backdrop of this is all out of this racial discrimination and these restrictive covenants and the policies and practices of urban renewal and gentrification that are at work. But important part of this that our conversation is today is how it was that despite all of this, African Americans, particularly here in North and Northeast Portland, turned all of those racist, discriminatory practices into a vibrant community. Is born out of people who made home and community in spite and despite the systems of oppression that sought to bind Black communities. So again, you have, through the Black activism that pushed the passage of the Fair Housing Act, through the Black newspapers, Black churches, leaders that developed their own Black realty boards and push local whites in the community and the leaders to do the things that they would not do. And so even now, in spite of that, we're battling kind of another type of restrictive covenant with what Michelle Alexander would call the new Jim Crow, with gentrification and urban renewal. But again, in spite of that, African Americans were able to turn these restrictive covenants and turn the racism and turn these negative practices into things that provided a sense of community, a collective identity, a sense of connectedness. And that's what we want to spend time focusing on today. So today I'll be moderating a panelist between the panelists and you, the audience, to highlight, as the flyer states, how African Americans who lived in Portland during the 20th century built homes and communities that provided connection among family and friends and space for growth and learning, as government policies, realtor practices, and beliefs expressed by dominant whites often restricted where and how Black people could live. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 challenged some of these discriminatory practices. This panel today of Black Portlanders who were all youths during this time period will offer firsthand reflections on the ways their families and neighbors built and sustained the meaning of home and community across the decades of the 20th century, despite the local and national blocs that sought to prevent them from doing so. That will be our focus today. So after I introduce the panelists here and ask them a series of questions and get them to kind of unpack their experiences growing up in North and Northeast Portland, then we'll open it up to the audience for question and comment, because I'm sure you'll have a lot. So this will be a dialogue and a conversation for all of us to participate in and kind of share in those experiences. So I'll start first by doing the introductions, and then I'll throw out a series of questions, and then just organic conversations will emerge. So I'll start to my left and introduce Ms. Faye Burch. Faye Burch is the owner and CEO of Faye Burch and Associates. It's a minority and women-owned business that specializes in public involvement and equity consulting and community and business development projects. Faye Burch, the principal of the organization, brings her talents and skills as a savvy business leader, public policy advisor, community activist to her projects. In particular, she is a strong advocate for small businesses, recognizing them as the foundation of our national economy. Ms. Burch has a decade of public policy experience, including 4 years with local government, 4 years serving as the senior policy advisor for intergovernmental affairs and small business to former Governor Barbara Roberts. Ms. Burch has been a housing advocate for a number of years, first as a survey and task force member of the city's growing numbers of abandoned buildings in the late 1970s and early 80s, through the reclaiming of the lost properties to the community from a roguish investor, Cyril Worm, the former City of Portland Commissioners Gretchen Kafori, and later Eric Sten. That was the creation of PCRI and many subsequent restoration efforts working with local CDCs. Ms. Burch and former Senator Avell Gordley first introduced the dwindling housing stock in North and Northeast Portland and the targeted speculators, talking with friends and relatives, and called for the mayor's tour of Williams Avenue in 2013, hosted by the Portland African American Leadership Forum. At that time, PALF called for the replacement of 10,000 dislocated North and Northeast Portland residents to refocus on housing. So we're lucky to have Ms. Faye Burch on this panel to give her esteemed experience. So welcome, Ms. Faye Burch. Next, I'll introduce to my left Mr. Kenny Adair. Mr. Kenny Adair's grandparents, mother, and aunt migrated to Vanport from Birmingham, Alabama in 1942. They, like many others, were seeking good paying employment available to African Americans and others in the Kaiser shipyards. They lived in Vanport for 6 years. When 4 months prior to the flood, his grandparents were able to buy a modest home in Albina on the corner of Monroe Street and Vancouver Avenue. That same year, on December 26th, after 66 hours of labor, Kenny was born. He adds this fact because from that day forward, he was always publicly, fondly, and jokingly referenced by the well-known African-American doctor, Dr. DeNorval Unthank, as the only child that ever caused him to miss Christmas Eve, Christmas, and most of the next day. Kenny's response, it sometimes takes longer to produce the best. Kenny attended Boise Elementary School and Benson Polytech High School. He attained an Associates of Science degree from Multnomah Junior College. He was on the Dean's List during his years at the University of Oregon, where he earned a BS in Sociology and an MS in Counseling Psychology and postgraduate studies in Higher Education, Administration, and Social Work. Kenny's professional career began in 1972 at Portland Community College and would span 31 years. His first position was at the Cascade campus. He was PCC's first African-American financial aid counselor. 4 years later, he relocated to PCC Sylvania campus as part of the school's counseling faculty, where he remained until his retirement in 2003 as head of the counseling office. During his tenure at PCC, Kenny provided the impetus and the administrative support for numerous events and programs focusing on diversity and student success at PCC, including the Gospel Extravaganza, Sylvania's Student Advising Center, and PCC's Multicultural Center. In recognition of those and other accomplishments, Kenny was awarded PCC's Excellence in Education Award. Kenny and his wife of 47 years, Harriet Glosson Adair, are retired, but are active participants in several Albina community groups invested in Portland, supporting Albina, past, present, and future. Please welcome Kenny Adair. I'll start to my right, introducing Mr. Ronnie Hartley. Was born in Vancouver, Washington in 1954. His family moved to the Irvington neighborhood in 1955, where he still lives today with his wife of 32 years. He attended Irvington Grade School, Grant High School, and Eastern Oregon University. He has 2 children, recently retired after 19 years from Providence Health Plan, where he was a manager of engineering. Please welcome Ronnie Hartley. And then finally to my right, Donna Harris. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, in Jim Crow South. She was educated in segregated black schools until moving to Portland, Oregon in 1965, where she completed her last 3 years of high school at Girls Polytech and received a full ride scholarship to Portland State University, graduating in 1971 with a Bachelor's of Science in Sociology. She worked as a probation officer with Multnomah County for 2 years. Donna benefited from affirmative action with IBM and was mandated to hire people of color and women in 1973. There she was trained as a systems engineer, working for IBM for 18 years. Afterwards, she worked for Xerox Corporation as a systems analyst and a training specialist for 10 years and spent 7 years at the United Way as a corporate relations executive. Donna is also the owner of Catering by Donna, that catering company for the past 20 years she has owned. Donna is currently employed as a consultant in development at Self-Enhancement, Inc. as a corporate fundraising executive. She is married to Antonio Harris. In their 34 years of marriage, they have a blended family of 4 daughters and 8 grandchildren. Please welcome Donna Harris. What an esteemed group of panelists we have today. So I'm just going to start it up with some questions, and I'll start to my left, and can go with Faye and Kenny, and we can just kind of work it out however it goes. But first, the question I first want to throw out as we kind of unpack, trying to understand what made North and Northeast Portland home and community despite the restrictive covenants and racial practices of the period. If you would tell us about the neighborhood you grew up in, and where were the places that made your neighborhood special or provided you a sense of connectedness? What made your neighborhood home?
Well, our neighborhood, actually I lived on excuse me, I lived on North Williams Avenue, right in the midst of the gentrification. And growing up there, our first home, my family bought our first home actually in 1949. They were unable to purchase it as a black family, so they bought it through a Jewish friend who later sold it to them on contract several years later. Not sure what they paid for it, because black folks tended to pay more for services and things that they bought. But living in our first home, it was a real stabilizer for us. We had a community, we had two-parent families in our neighborhood, we had the Maxis, we had the Broaduses, some parts of their family, we had the Locketts, we had the Malrays, we had all sorts of kids to play with and things that were very enjoyable to us. Our families were friends and we communicated together. Our families were very involved in associations, and I didn't know then why they were so active in many of those, but I do now. It was a sort of the thought of sticking together and feeling safe and feeling close. We built a great community, and as I look back, a lot of the people in our community are people who don't accept the status quo. There's Donna Maxey, there's her dad that many of us learned from, there's my sister, Avell Gordley. There's many folks that were ready to speak out, be activists, and become active in changing the practices and policies coming from our neighborhood.
I grew up 2 blocks from Emmanuel Hospital, corner of Vancouver and Monroe. At that time, it was a very vibrant community of African Americans. Still have white folks that said, well, I don't care if black folks move in my block, they ain't going nowhere, you know. My next door neighbors were a white Catholic family, had 8 in the family, and we had 2 mid-range in our age area that we hung out with and did bad things and you know, rode with our bikes, rode around when my parents didn't know. And next door to us was Truman and Mildred. They had a beautiful house, gambling joint, and a house of ill repute. I didn't know about the ill repute for a long time. She always, for some reason, she always called me her little pimp, you know, I don't know. And next door was a retired white couple called the Langsefs, you know, and they were very nice and sweet couple we always talked to and everything. Across the street were the only Chinese family, and father had sent for his mother. She came, and she was a very sweet woman, never learned English, but twice in the summer she'd come around with a big wicker basket to my grandmother, and, you know, ni hao, and, you know, give her this great big huge basket, and my grandmother was very gracious, and she was, see, I can't take all. No, you take, you know. The next door neighbor was Mrs. Grimmett, one of the first African-American teachers that taught and my kindergarten teacher at Boise Grade School, yeah, and so on and so on. So Pearl, Mr. and Mrs. Hill, their daughter went to University of Oregon for about 17, 18 years, but she had a head start. She was a year behind me in school, and so on. Now, the people where the Red Cross is right now is where my best friend grew up. So that was a community of neighbors all up and down were houses, and we got on our bikes. There wasn't a block that we didn't know. You know, my other grandparents used to live down where the Coliseum was, all the way down Williams Avenue and Vancouver Avenue, were African American homes, rental like 2- and 4-story buildings where people rented, and man, the nightclubs and et cetera. I just want to stop right here because I did bring this, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to have somebody come and get it, and I want you to pass it around and see it, because I want you to focus this. If you go to the corner of Russell and Williams Avenue, and think about that. See, there's this building right here. But okay, I want you to pass this around so people can see, and they can pass it around to people, because this is what it means for devastation. Talking about fair housing, is to see that your neighborhood is no longer, it's grass on that for blocks now were vibrant businesses, nightclubs. We have no black nightclubs in Portland now. Can you think about that? In this day and age, there was 5 or 6 black nightclubs you could go to. My uncle and aunt, they could put on their tux or put on whatever sharp they had on, and they could step out. Now they're no longer there. And one of the reasons is talking about fair laws in the state of Oregon. Black people couldn't get liquor. They still can't get liquor licenses. Think about that. You got all these young kids, white kids, that can go. Parents got money, or they raised some money, just like African Americans, and they go down and apply for a liquor license, and they get a liquor license. Their property grows. African Americans actually had, like you did, had to find somebody. Normally they were Jewish that would get a liquor license in their name, and then they had to pay. The black person that owned the business had to pay 7% back. This is in the state of Oregon. So I just want to let people know, get a feel for the community at this time, and a flavor that, for our age, especially beginning in the 60s, it started disappearing in front of us, On that corner, on that block, going all the way up, there was nightclubs, there was some pool halls, Chinese restaurant, my barber shop. Remember Citizens Lunch for many of us? You can go to Citizens Lunch, and there was a nightclub. So all up and down the community, and it's like an alien came into the community and kind of destroyed our community. And we've had to deal with this, that it's affected us. So I'll just stop there for a minute, and I'm going to pass it on.
Jesus, Mike, you guys can keep that.
Okay.
So Ronnie, again, tell us the neighborhood you grew up in, and what were the places that made your neighborhood special or provided you a sense of connectedness?
Irvington is the neighborhood I grew up in, the neighborhood I still live in today with my wife, Christine. Sorry. Irvington is the neighborhood I grew up in. It's the neighborhood I live in today with my wife of 32 years. My children were raised there. When I think of the areas that were connected, that I was connected to in Irvington, it would be Irvington School. We played football, basketball, baseball. We played football on the streets. There was Irving Park. There were a lot of families, dozens of black families, but also, as Mr. Adair talks about, there were many white families lived in the neighborhood as well. And I think that when I look back and preparing for this, I started thinking about the families that were important. They say, it takes a village. There was the Brandon family, the Wilson family, the Mullen family, the Thompson family. My best friend, Rory Thompson, Dr. Thompson's husband, is my best friend today. I met him in the summer of '68 on a corner in the neighborhood. We hit it off, and those times were special times. To me, it was always summer. It was never, you live in Oregon, you know it rains all the time. But to me, it was always summer. And we always had fun. There were always places to go. Mr. Adair talks about the Coliseum. My father was in the 60s into real estate. And I never understood what redlining was until he explained it to me later on in the later part of the 60s. But he could only sell homes in North Portland, not even Northeast Portland. And his office was on Borthwick, his first office. His second office was on Vancouver, and off Shaver. And I just remember that's how I got to know a lot of the families, a lot of the children that did not live in Irvington. Irvington was really pretty genteel. It was what I call the Donna Reed times. Not necessarily the white picket fence, but it was quiet, and the families were connected, and we had, I don't want to say a partnership, but friendships with the white families that lived there. It was really ideal for me. I think about those times then. Now I live in an area, Irvington, that's on the historical registry, the National Historical Registry, and the white families, the black families that lived there, dozens are gone. There's probably, I think, 4 families that I know of that still live in that neighborhood. A lot of folks from California, a lot of folks from New York. Housing prices are through the roof. Those are the folks can afford, and they've really moved into that. So back in those days, in the 60s, you know, I watched the Coliseum being built, Lloyd Center being built. I remember my Boy Scout time was there, my Explorer time was there. I know it's just something that connected you. You had black families and white families, Jewish families together that made up these groups, and they were welcoming. There were no issues necessarily with race that I could see, but you know, I was young then, and we were just playing ball. We were just having fun. We were just making friends. So I think Mr. Adair talks about the nightclubs that were there. I remember my parents getting dressed to go to the Jack and Jill Club. That was a big deal. It was a big deal for me because they were leaving. It was Friday night. They were leaving. You know what I mean? And so for me, it was just something to see my parents. They had card games that were attended predominantly by their friends that were black, but they had white friends that came over too. And so those were just ideal times that I'll never forget. And like I said, in preparing for this, I went back in time in my mind to try to remember all those things. But I think the families that were apparent, that I go back to the 60s, late 50s and 60s, those were the folks that I remember most. Those are the ones that, you know, if Mrs. Brandon found out or Mrs. Mullen found out or any of the mothers in the neighborhood found out you weren't doing right, your mother heard about it. And so there was a connection. And so those are times that I really loved. You know, going to North Portland, there were times when we weren't supposed to leave our neighborhood. But I got to know a lot of families that lived in North Portland, basically, and the only time I was over there was with my father, and he was kind of scouting a house. I know that one of the families that I remember that I still know today is the Nickerson family, Ralph Nickerson, I've known for a long time. And so I think those were times that I'll never forget, and I could go on, but I'm going to pass the mic.
Thank you. Am I holding it right now? Okay. I'm one of those people who, as she's already said in my little short bio, I didn't grow up in Portland, but I got here as a teenager, coming from, and I always tell people, I came from true Jim Crow South. So when I say Jim Crow, I went through the black people's toilets or bathrooms. The white people had their own water fountain. We had our own water fountain. It was, you know, it was labeled colored. And there were some places that we just could not go. So I grew up in a very segregated neighborhood. I emphasize that because when I first came to Portland, I looked for that same segregation. I didn't know any other. I was a teenager, and that's all I'd ever known my whole life. We moved when I first came, I came to live with my older sister. She had moved away from New Orleans to follow her father, my mom's first husband. She'd come out here living with her dad, gotten married, had 2 kids, and then came home to visit one summer. Told my mother, you need to let me take her back to Portland. She's a straight-A student, and she could get a much better education in the integrated schools in Portland, Oregon. And I bought that, came on up here, and she lived on Borthwick off Skidmore. That was a community. And I don't know what had happened before I got there, but it was very segregated. I mean, it was almost like I just was still living in New Orleans. There might have been one white family in about a 5 or 6 block radius that I walked around all the time. I fell in love with it. I didn't have to make a lot of adjustments in the community. Now, going to school was a different story. I won't go into that. But coming here to Portland, I didn't know anybody, so I made it a habit to walk up and down the street and meet people, because I got here in July and school hadn't started. So I had to find friends up and down the block, and I did, because it was true community. There was a drugstore this is close to now the historic Mississippi district, which I still live in. I've been in this home now. My husband and I, we bought this home 35 years ago, and I live now 4 blocks from Borthwick and Skidmore. I live on Michigan and Skidmore. So my experiences then I always loved food. I always found places that had food. So the black Muslims had a center right on the corner of Mississippi and Shaver. It's now a resale shop. And I would go over there because they had bean pies. And I would go over there every Saturday. Now, right across the street from there was Mr. Phipps' Rexall drugstore, and still got the sign up front. I don't know if any of you go to that coffee shop, but he had the old-fashioned spin-around stools, and you could go in there and get a root beer float. So that was something that we did. Now, just to give you a little backdrop, about 2 years after I got here with my sister, she convinced my mother to pack up the other 7 children. And so, was it 9, 8? 8 more kids, yeah, it's 10 of us. So anyway, so my mom came out, and we were all living in my sister's basement. She and her husband were renting a duplex right there on Borthwick and Skidmore. And we would, eventually, she put a lot of mattresses in the basement so that it would be a place for everybody to sleep. And that's what we did until my mom found a place to rent. But when all my brothers and sisters came here, we really made Mississippi Avenue our community. We were up and down from Fremont all the way up to Killingsworth. We would go on what we call day hikes, because over the area that is now Adidas, we would go over there, and it's on the bluff. So we would hike over there. We rode our bikes, and I think I'm an original bike rider. Nobody else was riding a bike back then. I was. But my brother had a bike, and I would steal it before he got up, and then I'd disappear most of the day on that bike. But it was, the community to me was, growing up in Louisiana and being so aware of social injustice, because it was something that they taught in the schools down there. We didn't have Black History Month. We had Black History Year. So when I first came, I immediately joined the NAACP Youth Council. Harold Williams was our president. And we would go to meetings on Sunday afternoons, and that was really, really big to me. I got to be active in the community, and we did everything we could. We protested, we made signs for everything. We showed up wherever we could to let our voices be heard. And we were generally anywhere from 14 to 21 years of age. The other thing that we did when I was young was being involved in the NAACP, and that's how I met, again, Ralph Nickerson. So Mr. Nickerson, Nate Nickerson, was the main person over there that we knew, and Mrs. Shelton Hill and Vernon Chapman. So people like that in the community, they really, they molded me, because I knew that, first off, I knew I was Black, and I was always going to be Black, so I needed to do things to improve the lot of my people. Also to help my mother, who was trying to raise these kids by herself. Put it out there, my father was abusive, and that's why she packed up and came out here to make a brand new start. But I wanted to also add that the community was one of those communities where I could walk everywhere I wanted to walk. So I'd go across across Skidmore, and the Levert family lived over there, and I met some Broaduses over that way. Then I walked down Skidmore all the way to MLK, and I met people that I know and love to this day. I met Faye when I eventually went to Girls Poly, and I remember meeting her as I walked the neighborhood. But it was really neighborhood. People cared for each other. We looked out for each other, and I think that's what I miss the most, because now where I live, I don't feel a part of community at all. My neighbors are all white. They're not, most of them are not friendly. They don't speak when I'm outside in the yard, and I know that's another story. But I'll be out in the yard, and I'll tell you, this really hurts sometimes. When I'm out in my yard, and we've been in this house for 35 years, I'll have white people come up and ask me, is the owner around? Do you know if they're interested in selling the house? The assumption is, we can't own this home. We get letters, and I guess it's okay to send letters, but to get letters every week asking you if you're ready to sell your home, and I don't have a for sale sign in my yard, or the number of whites who walk by and I speak to them and they don't speak back. Now, I know gentrification has happened, but it could be a friendlier gentrification. Just don't ig me because I'm outside, and don't assume that I'm the gardener in the yard. So those are the kinds of I know we call it microaggressions or whatever, but that's the hurtful part about the community, or the lack of community that we see in the Portland area. I don't think.
Yeah, no, this is good. Thank you. So we see a bunch of themes here that come out, the families and the experiences. Again, this was in the backdrop of restrictive covenants, of zonings, of the ways in which African Americans had to go through a third party, a white person, to be able to get a home. But yet we had this sense of community happening. So I want to kind of drill down a little bit more on the sense of community. I heard some family names mentioned, but what were some of the businesses that were important to your youth and development, or just your sense of connectedness in communities, places that you frequented that really helped to make North and Northeast Portland home for you?
Thank you.
Oh, you can use that one, yeah.
Thank you. There were a couple, the ones that Kenny talked about, but more specifically, my sister and I, in the Black family, you always have a grandparent that steps in when your parents or mother, father have to work. So on occasion, we would walk from our home to our grandparents' home, and we were fortunate that they also lived on Williams Avenue, just past Russell Street. So we had all sorts of friends in the vibrant business district that we would stop by. We would stop by that pool hall. We'd stop by Lou's Man Shop. We'd stop by the record shops, and everybody had candy for us and knew us by name. We'd stop by the Chinese restaurant and get fortune cookies, and every place we probably weren't supposed to be, but it was just fine, and we looked forward to that. Our mother would call, and why did it take you so long to get here? We had a few stops along the way. There was Lou's Man Shop and a number of things, but what occurred to me when they all disappeared is that they were all leasing. So when the white establishment got ready to clear them out and sort of bring other things in, they all had to go, and they all left at one time. So it was really a shock to our community. The other businesses that made an impact were, again, the Maxey grocery store. So Mr. Maxey, Charles Maxey, lived just the next block from where we grew up. And he came to Portland, he told us the story, very friendly guy. We all loved him. He told us the story. He came to Portland for a golf scholarship. And he was going to go to college, and when he got here, they saw that he was Black, and they withdrew the scholarship. So Mr. Maxey was not a bitter person in telling us that story, and certainly you would think, why not? He just had other plans. He just made a plan B. And so he started a barbershop called Maxey's Barbershop, and I think he took another name and had Cash Maxey Barbershop. And it lasted for a long time, very popular, very busy. They started a grocery store next to that barbershop. Well, we didn't understand then, but he was, sort of making his way, community economics. He also worked with a lot of the young people in the neighborhood, and that was our first job, to work in the Maxey grocery store and the barbershop. There's a lot of gentlemen or people, myself included, that ventured off into business when we grew older because of our experiences and the things that we learned from Mr. Maxey. So.
Thank you. I just want to piggyback on that whole thing Donna was talking about of living in her own neighborhood and feeling like she's displaced by the people surrounding her. And this Generation X, I don't know what the hell, I'm saying hell, but it's wrong with them, because that attitude goes throughout that whole community now. that they're like alien invaders, and and black people rightly feel that they don't want to have any association with them. They rarely, like she said, they rarely speak to an African American in the community. And think about this: when they came in and had businesses in the community, they never, I send out handbills. This is my business. Welcome to come into my neighborhood, into my business. Let's get to know each other. Buy my product. I know you. Blah blah blah. There's none of that from these people that own businesses and restaurants, and consequently, when you go down Mississippi or you go down Alberta and go to some of these communities, you rarely see an African American that that patronize their businesses, and I think that's just fine with them. But it's really a loss in the community. So what I'm saying is, to the Gen Xers or whomever else out there that's in the community that own businesses, that are in the neighborhood, is to begin approaching African Americans that still live in that community, because you both have a win-win benefit to humanity to live together as one, and in appreciation of each other. That you're not going any place, are you? And they're certainly not going anywhere. It's nirvana. You're a few minutes from downtown, and you got all these businesses and these places you can go. You can sit out on the sidewalks at night in these sidewalks cafe when black people couldn't get liquor licenses. You couldn't, and they certainly, the ones few that did, could sit out at night on the sidewalks. I mean, the police would come and tell them you're creating a racket and all this sort of stuff. So I just want to say that, I live out 135th and Fremont now, okay? And we sold our house in the inner city in about 1990. And I shop out there in that community. I go back into the hood to get my hair cut and various kind of things. But I saw, a black woman in grocery store out there at Winco, and she came out there and said, "Kenny, you live out here now?" I said, "Yeah." She said, and this is how she said it: "Lord, I live out here in the numbers too." I was thinking, oh my God, I mean, it sounded like Mississippi in 1940 or 1950. I mean, she was like so emotionally and mentally beat down, that now she was a displaced person, and that's what we have. That's a consequence of regentrification. We have a lot of people that have been displaced and living along the Max line and et cetera. And it's created a lot of mental health issues for people that live out there. The churches that they once attended this inner city, a lot of people don't go to church anymore. I just became a black member of a church after 50 years, but it's out in that community now. And when I see people, I invite them to come to church. I invite them to connection. Other thing I want to say is that one of the big connections, probably the biggest connection for me, is that I grew up with a lot of black men, and we hung out a lot, and we did things with our women, we partied, etc. And as we got older and began to die, and the community began to break up, every time we see each other was at a funeral. So we developed a group called the G Streeters, and then we changed it. Actually, when the gangs came to Portland, we could call ourselves the Ganbine Gang, and then Crips and Bloods came to Portland, so we changed it to the G Streeters. Okay, and now we just call it Friends, but it's a group of black men, and we have some whites in our group too, that just enjoy each other's company and remember the times we grew up together. And every year once a month, we have breakfast together. And every summer we have a picnic. We used to have a dance once a year, but that's a way of holding on to our community and to what we had. I thought I'd just throw that out at you for a minute.
Very good.
I think of the businesses, the black businesses in Northeast Portland, North Portland, that I remember most. There was Dean's Barber Shop. My father used to get his hair cut there, and he used to send me to Herman Bram's Barber Shop, which was down the street. I never understood that. Why he would send me there. I think a lot of business for him came through that particular barbershop for his real estate company. One of the other places I think that I remember most growing up was Lou's Higher Ground. That was a tavern, and Joe's Tavern. Lou's Higher Ground was kind of the mecca at one point, where a lot of black people went, a lot of African Americans went for a beer to hang out. It's a resale, yeah, right. So Lou's Higher Ground was really, I mean, like I said, it was always popping, as we say. Again, Ralph Nickerson was kind of a big deal then. He had been successful in high school football, Arizona State football. He had a lot of, he was getting a lot of accolades, and he didn't stop. He was part of the community. And at Lou's Higher Ground, we had a basketball team we played for. He kind of recruited me to play there, and I had a lot of fun, and I had made a lot of connections there, a lot of friends there who would just go in for a beer and say, "Hey, you guys win or lose?" But of course, we owned the city when it came to basketball, so that was no problem. I think one of the other businesses would be my brother Nathaniel Hartley. He had an oil business he started in 1965. And he really, serviced all the black families, most of the black families in North Portland. There was McCall's and there was one other, but he had a lot of business, and I got a chance to hang out in North Portland, and I was pulling the hose in the truck. So when we got ready to pull up to a house, there would be kids that I would know or I got to know. And they always laughed at me because I was always pulling a heavy oil hose to the back of their house, filling up with oil. But there were a lot of black businesses back then that we frequented, that were there, that we knew were there, and provided a lot of, kept us grounded. You see your own, you hang out with your own, and those were fun times. And so those are times I'll never forget. As I said, preparing for this, I went back in time and tried to think of all these things. But as I sit up here with these esteemed panel of individuals, they're helping me go back in time as well to remember those things that were done, those businesses that were there that are now, as Mr. Adair said, are grass fields. And so. Portland's my home, and I love the place. But I do still in Irvington face the same things. I have a lot of new neighbors. As I said, most Californians from New York, they don't speak. Some do, but most of them don't. I haven't had a chance to be the gardener yet, but you speak to somebody, you're washing your car or something, and look at you like you're an alien, like, oh God, you live there? I believe in what my parents did, what my father did, what he sacrificed in getting that home. And to me, that home is important, and so I take care of that home. I just recently redid the porch. There's a lot of pride when I look at that house. My nephews and nieces all tell me when I say, I'm in Mom and Pop's house, they say, no, this is your house. But it's really my parents' house. I'm a caretaker. They sacrificed. I do know what my parents paid for that particular home. Back then it was $12,000. I don't know, I don't imagine that he was able to do it on his own, but I really don't know, so I can't really say. But I do know what he paid for the house. And when I look at that house, I see my parents. I looked at pictures before I got here of my father in the driveway. And I just remember him toting me around to all these places, making me sit in the car while he went inside. A lot of black businesses, but I just remember those times, and for me, they were fantastic times.
Well, I can really go down memory lane because when I first came, I had to find a church, because growing up Baptist in Louisiana, my mother told me when you get up there, make sure you find a good church. So walking from the Borthwick and Skidmore, I walked north, and I found a church. It was called New Hope Baptist Church. It was right on the corner of Borthwick and Killingsworth Court. And I don't know if anybody remembers this, but it's still a little white church there. And I walked there every Sunday, and for about a month. And then one Sunday I went, and there was a sign on the door saying they'd moved. And I thought, what? I didn't know anybody. I was just attending. And there was a lady who came up, and it was a white lady. And I said, well, what happened to this church? I've been coming here for a month. She said, oh, baby, they moved over here on North Gantenbein. So she put me in her car, and she took me to 3725 North Gantenbein. I'll never forget it. And that was New Hope Church. And I started going to that church in 1965. I joined that church. I got baptized through that church. They had run out of money when they were building it, and they were worshiping in the basement. So when I joined, they said, we're going to take you down to St. Mark Baptist Church on Rodney. They have a pool, so we can baptize you there. So one Sunday, I went over with the pastor and a few of the deaconess in the church, and I was baptized as a Baptist in complete immersion. So I have fond memories of New Hope Baptist Church. I belonged there for 35 years until my husband convinced me that going to Mount Olivet was the church that he wanted us to belong to. So we've been at Mount Olivet now for almost 20 years. That's when we talk about things that are important, things that I remember. Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church, one of the oldest Baptist churches in Portland, right there on Vancouver Avenue across from the American Red Cross. That was the center place for me, and a lot of the people that I went to school with, they attended that church and had a good choir. I couldn't sing worth a lick, but I joined the choir at New Hope, and we would have different programs that we'd be on program, and we'd go from church to church for different events. And Vancouver Avenue, Allen Temple Church, I'm trying to remember the other church anyway, we had great churches that I remember. I'm going to go a little further down on North Russell. I would go down to Mr. Campbell's Cleaners. Mr. Campbell was the only black cleaner that I knew of until a little later. There was a lady, and she passed away, but she was on Williams Avenue. But black people tended to go to the cleaners that were owned by black people. So Mr. Campbell, he had this little buggy type car. I don't know what it was. It looked like a Model T Ford, but he had a Campbell's Cleaning painted on the side, and he'd come by and pick up your clothes. And then he'd bring them back to you. And it was just great. And it reminded me of something in New Orleans, and it was great. I'm going to come up a little further around the corner there to the Cotton Club. Oh, you couldn't tell me that wasn't the best place that you could ever go to. I was 19 years old going to Portland State University and too young to go to the Cotton Club. But I had a gimmick. I would go to there's always there someone sitting at the front asking you for ID. And, Kenny can tell you, I probably weighed about 100 pounds. And I looked like I was 15 probably. But I'd go in there and I'd say, I left my umbrella here last week. Can you look for it? And then she started looking for it, assuming that, she must have been here before, but I'd never been, I didn't need an umbrella. I just wanted to get in the door. But Cotton Club, they used to bring a lot of nationally known artists to Portland. And there's some signs, probably at the Oregon Historical Society, that show the different artists who singing groups who came. It wasn't people like the Temptations or anything like that, but some pretty good names back then. So wanted to go there. Pardon?
Blue Magic.
Oh yeah, Blue Magic. So anyway, that was a thing. And I'm going to go around the corner because the other place that I went to a lot, again focusing on food, was Neighborhood Bill's grocery store. It's just a little mom and pop store, and Faye hasn't mentioned it, but her mom worked there. And for a long time, and I would go there because I found food that I was used to being able to eat in Louisiana. They sold ham hocks and and I know some of you are going to say, ugh, pigtails, yes, I ate them, and all these kinds of foods that I was used to. Chitlins, I didn't like chitlins, but anyway. But you would buy, I would go there, my sister would send me, or my mom would send me down to that store on my bike. And I would go and get those things at Bill's store. And it was community. You go in there, Mr. Benton would give you advice. When he found out I was going to college, he gave me a job, because for a while there was Neighborhood Bill's country-style sausage, which we could buy in the store at Safeway or Fred Meyer, because they got contracts to sell their product in those stores. So I would be back in the sausage part of they built a little plant in back, and we actually made sausage back there. I'd go to the Safeway and the other Fred Meyer, and I would be a demonstrator, and I'd cook the sausage, and we'd try to sell it. And it thrived for about 4 or 5 years. Bill Benton Jr. ran that business. I'm going to come up the street because Tropicana on Williams Avenue was the place that I liked to go to because they had good barbecue. And like I said, I focused on food, but that was right there on around the corner from Vancouver Avenue Baptist Church. It stood for a long time. I don't know if she wouldn't sell, but it was black-owned, am I right? Mm-hmm. And then across the street, just a little bit up the street there, was Doris's Cafe. I loved me some smothered pork steak and rice and gravy, candied yams, and some greens, cornbread too. And they cooked it just like they cooked it in Louisiana. So I made a point to get there as often as I could. Now, just a block up the street on Williams Avenue was the Sportsman Barbershop. Willie Harris, bless his soul, may he rest in peace. I would go in there all the time. He just was he became a friend. He'd argue with you about everything. He knew everything, but you could always find out the latest scores for any basketball games, football games, whatever, and he'd tell you who's going to win. And even if his team didn't win, he'd swear how they could have won. But it was an excellent place. I mean, I'd sit there, and I was young to be sitting among that crowd, but I enjoyed being there because, again, it made me feel like the community that I'd left in Louisiana. Right next door to Willie's Barbershop, he and David Dawson had gone into business, and they built a House of Sound record shop. I loved music, and I'd go in there, and pretty soon, you know, if I stayed long enough, I might be able to get out of there with a used album that they'd been playing, and they didn't need it anymore, because I didn't have any money. And I'm going to come just a little further up, because, again, Maxie's grocery store was another place that we went to. The last one that we trek over to, and my mother would get angry when we went to it, but there was a store called Grenfell's, and Grenfell's is right there on the corner of Martin Luther King and Skidmore. And it was a white-owned place, but there were some things on the shelf that we could find there that reminded me of Louisiana, so I'd go in there to get those specialty items. So I have great memories of, and most of my memories are when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, but great memories of all those places that now that I'm living my mother lived on Albina and Skidmore. When she eventually got a home, we lived right on the corner of Albina and Skidmore. Big house, 6 bedrooms. We no longer had to sleep on mattresses. We had beds. And when we lived on Albina and Skidmore, we pretty much stayed around that neighborhood. Didn't really traverse far from that area. And we go as far as, like I said, the Nickerson's house and the Harrises and the Jacksons and all the people who lived, the D.D. Waters family. All of those people I got to know really well in that neighborhood.
Excellent ideas and memories of businesses and what we learned from them. I'm going to open it up for questions after this final question here. Wanted to ask you all in thinking about your childhood experiences in your neighborhood, what you learned from your experiences that you now have transmitted to your family and friends and loved ones now as an adult. What did you learn?
Let me think about that. I think I'll pass on to Ken while I think about it.
What's your takeaway from all this?
You know, what I really learned is that when you live among different people, you respect different people. And when you live apart from people, you fear people. And white people that have never grown up and lived around black people, except when they do subservient things like clean their house, are fearful from African Americans. My next door neighbors were white. Tommy and Johnny, and me and Donnie, my brother, and Billy Anfield, my cousin and stuff. We used to rip and run through the neighborhood on our bikes and have a good time. I never thought of them as white, you know. I just thought of them as human beings, you know. We even let Hubert Lee come along, the only Chinese on the block, and only one that we ever went to my grade school, Boise grade school. So I'm just saying that that's one of the things and then we had, and then you learn to recognize who's friendly to you and who's not. It was a great growing up environment. I remember around the corner on Williams Avenue there was a German couple, and they were senior citizens, and they were really taciturn people. You know, it's like come in and get your stuff and leave. You know, I always remember they had a sign on the wall behind the cash register, and here's what it said. To trust is to bust. To bust is hell. No trust, no bust, no hell. You can laugh if you want to. In other words, come in and buy my shit, but you can't get nothing free. Don't ask for nothing, you know. And so we respected that. We just came in and bought stuff. We didn't say hi, bye, and they had that mean look on their face, et cetera, like that. And we know who didn't like us, et cetera, but we really learned the humanity of people in that neighborhood, the friends, et cetera. When I started college, the bus driver used to come down a kitty corner from my house. My house is right on the corner of Vancouver and Monroe. And when he saw me coming out the door to run over to the bus, he didn't drive away. He knew I was in college, you know. He's a white guy who drove the bus. And if I was 2 minutes late, he would wait for me to get on the bus so I wouldn't miss my class, you know. And that was the kind of neighborhood that we grew up in.
I think for me, my takeaway, a lot of what Mr. Adair is saying is, and my father brought me up to believe that you take people as they come. So the one thing that I've pushed out, that I've learned, that I've passed on to my children, and by the way, I've got about 60 family members in the city with my last name, so there's an awful lot of us. But what I remember, but what I would tell them is that you do have to take people as they come because you never know what you're going to get. But the other piece is, I grew up in a neighborhood that were two-parent homes, two-parent families, a lot of kids, and I always want them to remember where they came from and to understand that family and working and talking and kind of trying to understand other people is really where you're going to get pushed in life. Both my kids are graduate of Oregon State. I think they've taken what I've said to heart in trying to know others, but to also understand that family is really that village. I grew up with a lot of families, a lot of two-parent families. You didn't get away with anything, and they always reminded you that, that you were loved. We didn't have problems with any of the white families. People just lived, and that's what I remember most. I just remember, like I said, it was always summer. We were always playing football. We had teams of all the kids in the neighborhood that would get together, go to Irvington School and play on the playground. And so what I remember and what I passed on is family is everything. You remember where you come from so you know where you're going. But also to know that there are others along the way that you're going to meet that can help you in ways you just don't know. You don't think about it. You just meet them, you hang out, you talk, you find out, years later that they may own a business. You walk in and they say, "Hey, I remember you. Hey, I remember you." So those are the things I remember, and those would be my takeaways and the things that I passed on to my kids.
Yeah, I did have something I want to share. I think one of the things I learned was that that things that you feel need to be changed, that there is an opportunity to have a voice, and your voice can be heard. You can participate. I was always very curious. Me and my sister, we'd go to every march, every meeting that we could. We'd watch our parents participate in the social service and civic groups that I mentioned. If it was for the men, it was the Masons. For the women, it was the Eastern Star and Harriet Tubman, and every other club our parents were involved in. We'd always learn from that, their gathering and what it meant to organize and what it meant to participate. Thank you.
I think the thing that I've probably embraced throughout life is the importance of just knowing who you are and what your capabilities are, to do the very best. I have one daughter by birth, and then I have three daughters my husband gave me. So I try to instill in them I want them to go out and try to better the community. Now, this one daughter, Karis, she took me literally, and she probably sits on every board and every committee in this city. She's very, very active in just about any aspect of the city that you can imagine. She sits on the the Boise Neighborhood Association, and she comes. I don't have the time to do all that because I'm so busy babysitting her my two grandsons. Her husband's a professional saxophonist, and he's always out of town. So I get to keep kids, and I told her, I said, okay, I've done all that, so now it's your turn. So what I find is trying to instill not only in her, but in all of my family members. My maiden name is Miche, and I try to get the Miches to see the necessity of being involved in the community. And I know sometimes I probably push the race thing probably a little further than I should. Even my daughter will say, don't play the race card, Mom, please don't play the race card. But there are things that happen that I don't like. I don't like to see social injustice in any form. I don't like unfairness. And that's what I've learned in these 69 years of living. I would like to see Portland become a place where we can coexist, where we can, and I'm not going to do the Rodney King, can't we all just get along? No, that's not it. I would like to see people sincerely care about each other in this city, regardless of the color of their skin. And it's really bad because right now, and I don't know if anybody else has noticed it, but I've noticed even when I'm driving that I'm treated pretty unfairly in this community now. I have people who will, it's like as soon as they get close enough to me and they see that I'm black, then they'll be at a stop sign, they'll pull out. Next thing I know, I'm dang near getting hit. Or there's some times, I was going down I-5 south, and there was a guy who flipped me off and called me the N-word. And we were not, I didn't cut him off. So those are the kinds of things that just rile me, because I'm wondering, do you hate me just because of the color of my skin? Do you say those things just because the color of my skin? Get to know me. And that's what I teach the kids. Get to know the person. I've got those grandsons, and my little grandson, I tell this story. My little grandson, he goes to the Madeline School. It's a Catholic school on 24th and Fremont. He is the only black boy in the second grade. He was told the question was, if I were president, I would. It's a second grader assignment. So my daughter and her husband, they are very, very, they want the kids to understand everything. And he's 8 years old. Even the 3-year-old, they teach him all the things that are going on in the world. So they showed him what happened to Tamir Rice. And for at the time he was 7 when it happened. And he's seen some of the injustices that happen as far as little kids being sexually molested. So when he wrote the paper, it was only 3 sentences that he wrote. He said, if I were president, I would make sure that if a person sexually molested another person, they would go to jail. I would make sure that if a police officer hurt or killed a black person, they would go to jail. And the third thing he said, I would make sure that everybody would have a chance to go to college. Now, I don't know where the college came from, but that was what he wrote. Now, there's not a black teacher at the Madeline School. There's his teacher and the assistant in the room, teacher aide, looked at his paper and said, Michael, we need you to rewrite this. This isn't appropriate. Because this isn't the way you should be thinking. So what do you think about dogs? Don't you think dogs should be treated better? Don't you think we should do better in the community, making sure there's, I forget, because Michael's scared to death of dogs too, that's the other thing. So anyway, she gave him his paper and told him to take it home, and then the next day they were gonna write another paper. So the next day he wrote a paper about, something about dogs, I don't remember it. But my daughter and her husband, Mike and Karis, they saw what he'd written and he said, I have to write it over. So they brought it back to the teacher, just live it. I mean, and like I said, my daughter can go off. So she, and I mean, she's well educated. I mean, she's no dummy. So she goes in to the school and just tears into the office. I want to see this teacher right now. I want to talk to this person. I got to talk to the assistant. Don't ever censor my child. Don't censor his thoughts. This is what he's learned, and this is what he thought, and he thought like a second grader. So don't tell him what to write. And they went on and on. I mean, she's probably there for about an hour. But that's what I don't want to see. You asked what I want to see, but my takeaway is to let people be able to live and think what they think, live feeling that they can voice whatever they feel, like we're doing right here, and not have to worry about censorship or people just putting you down. So we may not agree on everything, but I think we could at least sit in a forum like this and voice our different opinions and still respect each other.
Well said. What an excellent panel and excellent feedback. Let's give them another round of applause. My goal was to ask some questions, to draw some things out from them, to give you a sense of what their experiences have been. Again, I consider them to be organic intellectuals of the community because they live through these experiences. And we could go on forever and asking more questions. I can, but I want to involve you in the remaining minutes that we have. Eliza, I'm not sure how much more time that we have, but I think we have about 5-7 minutes. Okay. So I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions that you have for this esteemed panel so that you can ask them some questions and learn more, maybe draw out some more information that I haven't asked. So feel free. Those of you who have questions, raise your hand, and Eliza, or do you want everyone to come to front? Someone come up to the microphone. This is like C-SPAN if you watch it. Come up to the microphone, state your name. You may have a question, you may just have a comment or a statement, but feel free, come on up.
Hi, thank you. My question is, how do you establish community when there is no community to start with because everyone's moving around and constantly being moved out of their place?
That's a hard question. That's a hell of a hard question, you know, because I think you have to use certain organizations, I think, to bring communities back together when in this despair. You know, like these people, thousands of people now displaced that are living on Stark Street and Burnside, etc. I think there have to be some organizations from organizations, African American, to reach out to them, to redevelop a community. Obviously, they're not going to be able to go back and get the kind of housing that's in that neighborhood. So I think churches, you mentioned organizations, social organizations that have been in the community for years, like Masons. I'm a Mason. For college-educated people, probably not so much. But I'm saying I'm a member of a black college fraternity. But I think we have to reach out to each other and have them meet in that community and start being a part of that community in a togetherness way. So what I do now, let's just speak for myself, when I see a black man my age and younger, because now in my group now we have the younger generation. We started out with 6 or 7 as we regrouped. Our friends organization used to be called the Ganbine Gang, and now we started out with 6, and now we have about maybe 40, 50, 60 for breakfast the first Saturday. And I encourage anybody who's African American to come up to me and ask me where we having these meetings at, and I'll tell them. But that's a way of reconnecting. You know, we actually have some people who grew up in the albino community. We have a couple that come down from Seattle just to get that sense of community with black men. Black women need to organize black women to get together, you know, and then again, of course, through the church. So I think I've got to put more thought into it, you know, how to do it, because it's very complicated, you know, when you start thinking about it. But you got to do it one step, one person at a time. When I go to the store, somebody, hey, you know, I got a church out here off 122nd and Walker. It's on 117. You know, church starts at 12:30. You got a church home. Oh yeah, maybe if you're not able to get over to where you used to go to church, you need church over here. So that's my thought.
Thank you.
I think that one of the things my neighbors have done, and as I said, my neighbors are all white now. So the neighbor across the street, when she first came, she says, okay, I'm a bleeding heart white liberal, is that the phrase? Anyway, her name is Kim, and she says, we're gonna have community over here. And I noticed how, you know, nobody ever talks to anybody, so she started creating little gatherings at her home, and she and her husband, we go over there for different events. And she invites everybody, probably for about 3 blocks, up and down Michigan Avenue and also down Skidmore. And these neighbors, we come together and we talk about some of the same things that we're talking about tonight. And they have a wine hour sometimes. Sometimes there'll be a barbecue. But that's the community that we're trying to develop in our community, because we haven't had that, and we just felt so excluded. So we passed out a directory, so now we do a neighborhood watch. Everybody's got everybody's phone number. When we're out of town, we tell each other where we're going and when we're coming back. So the kinds of things that people used to do, and now we're doing it with the new neighbors. Now, some neighbors aren't participating, but if you've driven down my street, there's 4 homes that are up for sale that are $1.1 million apiece. So those neighbors haven't really come over yet, but the ones that have sold. But that's what we're doing.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you guys so much for taking the time and coming here and discussing things that we all need to be discussing. The question that I have, and I apologize, it's not directed specifically at any one of you, but you guys all discussed about your community that you grew up in and the realization and knowledge and the understanding of knowing what was happening. If one of you or two could give a personal connection to an understanding or experience of one of those neighbors that did either get, pushed out or had to leave your neighborhood, or that experience of seeing, one more white person move in, another white person move in, another person move in, and seeing your historic Black community kind of being dissolved. Of course, you guys discussed that you guys were friends, families with these people. I think that a personal sentiment would be wonderful to discuss.
So what are you asking us to do?
Basically, a personal sentiment of one of the friends, families, people that you guys grew up with in those neighborhoods when they had to leave, or noticing that these Black people were leaving the neighborhoods, what those reasons were, and any communication or discussions that you guys had about it at that time.
Well, you know, I have some bitterness, so I'll say this real fast, okay? We had a neighbor who lived on Borthwick, and a few years ago, she got hit by a bus, and she was killed. And her family went to the house thinking that she still owned the home. And they did, you know, she was killed so suddenly. So her family goes in and they're, you know, packing up stuff and getting things together. And a person comes to the door and says, you know, I own this home now. And she was older, she had some senility, and a white person had taken advantage of her and given her, you know, had her sell the home to him, and then they were willing to let her live there until she passed away. And at that point, they take ownership of the home. So when you think about sentiments, you know, that's when I get angry and think, you know, there's been a lot of cases, you've seen it in the Observer and in the Scanner, of older Black people who were preyed upon, and people came in and took possession of their homes, because, like you said, they paid $12,000 for a house. So you come to an old Black person, and they're sitting in this home, they've been there for 40, 50 years, they only paid $10,000, $13,000, and now somebody offers them $100,000, they think they've hit the jackpot. Okay, this is a lottery. I'll sign this paper and that's fine. And that's what's happened in the community. So there is some resentment that is still lingering because of situations like that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick thing, and that is the observation, Donna, very similar. So when our parents were no longer living in their house, there are people that sort of troll the neighborhood. And they know when nobody's there, when the lights are out, so they ask around. Then they visit the senior retirement homes in the area, and they'll go to Emmanuel Hospital when we lived on Williams Avenue. So they went to Emmanuel Hospital looking for my dad. They had papers with them, and it just so happened a nurse called us and said, there's some people here that want to buy your dad's house. And of course, he was not well at the time. That's why he was in the hospital. So they look for every opportunity to take advantage. There was another family, the Fraser family, and we use that as an example when we took the mayor's tour that we mentioned, that Carmen mentioned in 2013. The Fraser family had a great big house on Wygant Avenue, and she put it in the hands of her granddaughter. Her granddaughter was a single parent, and she wanted to make sure they were taken care of. When she passed away, the granddaughter got offered $10,000, not $100,000. And she had bills, and that was a lot of money to her. So she sold their family's home for $10,000. And now there is Wygant Commons on that corner, 6 houses, almost $1 million each. So.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you again, all of you, for coming and taking the time to share your stories. I'm doing research on Black banks and financial institutions. I'm wondering, I really liked how you guys are talking about the different businesses, and I wonder if you could speak to the NAACP Federal Credit Union and Freedom Finance Bank, which was later the American Finance Bank on Killingsworth, and how that was a community asset, cultural asset, what your experiences were, and were there other sort of financial institutions you guys used to circumnavigate racist banking policies from white mainstream banks? And I'll sit down so you don't have to sit.
That's a pretty good question.
I only had one that was with the realty company. When I was trying to buy my first home, I called, I won't say the name because it still exists, but I called this one, and it was a home that I thought I could afford. So I told him the address, and maybe I sounded white on the phone, because he said, are you sure you want to look at that house? Because that's a neighborhood where mostly Negroes live. And this is back in the 70s. And I said, well, I'm a Negro, so I'll probably feel pretty comfortable over there.
And my only experience is with the Albina Community Bank, and they've recently sold to Beneficial and will now be a different bank. But I did some work for them as a consultant. I was a borrower in early years for my first home that I purchased, and they often were not able to give you the best percentage rate that's available out there in the marketplace, but they sometimes are the only people that will lend to you. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes black people, black families have had to pay a higher price, and I think it's the same for business. So.
Good evening. It's really a joy to have this panel here. You guys have really knocked it out of the ballpark. You really have. One of my, I have a question, but before that, I'm going to make this little comment. Oh, first, a little disclosure. I got two buddies sitting up here, Faye Burch and Adair, I've known for a long time.
Faculty members at Portland Community
Right.
College.
One of the things that seems to me comes across out of the spectrum of perspectives and experiences that you've shared with us is a sense that it's been something that's kind of been on my mind for a number of years, particularly during this period when we've really gotten more and more into, I never use the word gentrification without saying displacement and gentrification, because that always comes first. But the thing is that in America, as far as I can see, and I've traveled a little bit and I've done some things, one of the concepts that's often left out is a true sense of what that simple word community is. People know about families, people know about cities, there's geographical designations that call neighborhoods, but community is something different. And you guys are reflecting that so well, and particularly with the different perspectives that each of you bring to it. And that's one of the things when we talk about displacement, gentrification, most people only are thinking of that in economic terms. You know, oh, they lost these homes, or they lost these businesses, or they're dispersed. All of that is true. But what's more essential, and I hope that's the thing that really comes across to the people that are here, it's more than the physical homes and even the businesses and the recreational centers and clubs or whatever. There's like a network. I hope people really been getting this, because different people have hit it different ways, where families knew each other, and then their kids knew each other, and then beyond the families and kids, the people in the stores knew each other. And like you were saying, it was not back in the day uncommon for a kid to go into a store and not be looked at as a potential thief, but somebody give them a candy. Somebody give them a fortune cookie. I mean, that's a whole, there's a whole weaving of a whole kind of relationships and concepts that go into the word community. And so thank you for really helping to highlight that. And now to my question. You thought I'd never get there, didn't you? My question is, of the things that I've kind of kept up with history, Portland history, Black history, and so forth. And one of the things I often come across in terms of part of this weaving of things together, and Kenny kind of referred to it a little bit, but I wish each one of you would touch on it. When you talked about the homes, the schools, something about economics and real estate. There was some reference to churches and that kind of thing. One of the things that Kenny referred to, I'd like to hear each of you kind of give what your experiences were, whether it was your own experience or your parents' experience. Social organizations like the Links, the Masons, the clubs. There was all kind of women's clubs, or what was it called, the Black women's clubs, and then there was, there was all kind of clubs. Some were for men, some were for women. I don't know if any of them were for both, But what you know, either yourself being involved or your parents. I'll sit down and you can go ahead on.
I think I'll start there. I was the youngest of four actually. My brothers were 15 and 17 years older than I was, so I was really, as they call it, the mistake. But the Masons were big, and that all of my father, my brothers were in the Masons, and I was really young, and so those were things, clubs. I mean, I'd hear about them, I'd see a little pin, I saw reference materials too, but it's not something I really understood. But the one thing that I didn't understand the club, but I did understand the importance of that club to my father and brothers. It was a place to meet. They talked. Every so often, you sit around the dinner table, or it's Thanksgiving, it would come up. Of course, being young, I'm like, well, what are the Masons? I just knew it was important. My uncles were involved in that. And so I think when I think of the clubs for men, I think of the Masons. Another thing I'd like to talk about is the gentleman was speaking about, you go into a store and you get a candy instead of being looked at as a thief. That's because the proprietor knew you, knew your family. He knew who you were, and so he may not know everything about you, but he'd look at your face and you'd say, "What's your name?" And Ms. Harris would say your name, and, "Oh yeah, you so-and-so's daughter, and I've seen this or that." So those things were important, but to the question, the Masons were important in my family to my brothers.
Well, in my family, the church was very important, so my mother was very much into her mission board, her usher board, the mother's board, so my mother, and the Eastern Star. Now, for myself, I am a very active member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and hey, so Kenny's wife is out there, also my soror sister. The other thing, I'm still, I pay my dues, but I just don't do what I should, I think, with the NAACP anymore. I used to be pretty active with it, and I haven't been, so I apologize for that. The other community thing that I do is I serve on some different subcommittees, and I am volunteering a lot. And I find that, like, one of the reasons I couldn't come and eat tonight, my husband and I and his brother, I think, is here. We feed the homeless on Monday nights, and it's not a club or a group or anything like that, but we saw the need to give the homeless. We had a friend who said that he used to be homeless. He'd been in jail, and when he came out of jail, he had no place to go. So he was out there, and he said there were nights when he didn't have anything to eat. He said the shelters would feed him sometimes as early as 4 o'clock. And then you had to put your name in a lottery in order to be able to get a bed, and he just wished that he had a place, he wanted a midnight snack. That's basically what he wanted. He said, we ought to do something like that. So we started doing this, I think it's been 7 years now. So every Monday night, we make, tonight I made about 90 sandwiches, and we give them a bottle of water. We buy socks at the Dollar Tree, and we can get almost, sometimes 2 or 3 pairs of socks for $1. One of the things you don't think about is people who are homeless, they don't have a washing machine, so they wear those socks until they fall apart. So we give them socks, we give them gently used clothing, some toiletries, and I'm trying to remember everything I can't. But anyway, we set up our tables on the corner of Southwest 2nd and Burnside every Monday night, and that's something we feel is, it's not an organized group, but that's what we find ourselves doing. The other thing that I find is helpful is I deliver Meals on Wheels. I feel that that's something that is good to do. I know I'm getting at that close to that age where somebody might just have to bring me a meal. So, so that's one other thing, and then the other one is just volunteering part-time at Self-Enhancement Incorporated. It's an organization here that works with youth. Right now it's over 10,000 youth that they're working with, especially those who are out in East County. When you talk about displacement, those young kids who are out there in what they call the numbers, they don't have that sense of community that we had over here. They're everywhere. And SEI has set up some centers at David Douglas and Park Rose High Schools so those kids can feel a sense of community and some people of color who care about them.
And just real quickly, when you said clubs, I was also thinking of Geneva's Social Club, one that we didn't mention. And certainly our neighborhood was full of jazz and people who frequented jazz. Many people came to town. Singers, entertainers. There was always a problem of where would they stay. Certain places wouldn't house them in Portland. There's a lot of places where they used to be that are, I don't know about the panel, but for me are very difficult places. Like the Left Bank used to be, you know, an African American club, and it was, there were hotels, there were places where the entertainers could stay and play, and all those were replaced. I just had wished and hoped that when one black business was taken away, it would be replaced with another. Some things get out of date, you know, like a car repair shop, and you're moving to bicycles. Well, you know, not everybody rides a bicycle. Some people still use cars, but if you're going to have that kind of change, there's another black business that could move into those places. Williams Avenue just does not need to look like it does.
You know what, I keep saying I'm making a commitment this month to join the Black Elks, you know. There's a YMCA that sit down on Williams Avenue, and I'm sure you know where that's at. But really it's owned by when we grew up, it was a place for black people to go for dance. It still is now, and other social events. But I'm going to join and just for support, because it's another building and another institution it's on the cusp of not being there. And I think every black man in here, you hear that, should run out and join and be a part of that membership and association. Since in the last 4 years of my tenure, 31-year tenure at Portland Community College, you know, I used to always get the stuff from the college and give money to the college through the foundation for scholarships and this one thing and another. And I had an epiphany one day, and that is I can contribute to the scholarship and name my scholarship. And that's what I did. So I started dumping money into the foundation for a Adair scholarship that would support every year a graduating African American male graduating from a Portland public high school. And so I'm proud to say that I've got about, time. I'll stop. I'm proud to say that I've had about 17 black males from Portland Public High School with Adair scholarship. Then 3 years ago when I became a member of Bethesda Baptist Church, my wife and I started, and then the next year my wife started putting scholarships together. I have a scholarship in my grandparents' name for a black male student at our church for continuing education. So not just for somebody graduating, somebody who didn't finish, somebody who wants to start, you know, so it's for continuing education. And my wife as well has a scholarship for a female. My wife, Dr. Harriet Adair, 47 years at Portland Public Schools, just retired recently as assistant superintendent. So I want you to honor my wife too.
I'd just like to add something really quickly about the Billy Webb Elks Lodge. One of the things I do, since I'm a business owner, is I work with startup businesses, and I also work a lot with construction and design businesses, and I consider their skill a real gift. So we were looking for a community service project in the community. We had really what I would call a cush year. TriMet's great working with minority and women-owned businesses. So we had a chance where we had lots of projects and we're making money and wanted to give something back to our community. So we remodeled the Elks Lodge. It looked like something under a bridge. We weren't even safe to hold a meeting in there. It was that bad. It was dry rot. It was an absolute mess. They had used formaldehyde to put the carpets down and all sorts of things. Red ant farms were growing. You name it, it was there. We remodeled that building as one of the few buildings owned by African Americans in the community, and something we're very proud of.
We'll take our final question.
Okay, it's not really a question. I taught for 35 years, and I have never heard a teacher tell a kid not to write something. Where I've taught, but I've taught. I taught in the 70s at Sabin, I taught at John Ball, and I taught the rest of my career at Fabian. And I think I know one kid at the Madeline because his mom makes him go, you know, his grandmother, because they pay for it. And I don't know anything else about the school, but that teacher should not be teaching. Honestly, I don't care what kid it is. And now I volunteer at the community transitional school for homeless kids, and a lot of the kids there are Hispanic, and they're writing things about, like, my dad got deported. And that hurts, you know? And they need to write the things they believe, and kids are not stupid. I had 6-year-olds that could come up with the best stuff, you know? And there was a little girl in my class at Sabin, but I was really young, and I'd say her name because I've always wanted to find out what happened to her. But the girls were saying, you guys always get the good toys and we have to play with dolls. And they got in that conversation, and this little girl says, well, when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor. And the boys said, you can't be a doctor, you're a girl. And she said, you're going to be my goddamn nurses.
All right. You know, this has been a wonderful evening of sharing. I thank you for coming out. I just want to, as a final note, just congratulate these panelists for just really epitomizing community and what the spirit of Portland is about. Yes, yes.
Can I just say, I had that thought in my head somewhere and lost it, but I just want to say, when we went to school in the inner city, you know, we had, in the 50s, 35 to 40 students in the class. And we learned reading, writing, arithmetic, you know. It was just expected, where now people get upset if they have they don't have an aide in the class with 20 students. You know, we just had that whole feeling that there was a diversity, and I'm not saying, we just had that whole feeling that we could do anything if we wanted to do it. We had that spirit in our neighborhood, and it was a loving spirit through the church, through the schools, through every, you know, Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, which I was a member of. I should mention that because one of my greatest experiences in life was to go to National Jamboree with 300,000 other people from around the world. And so that community, that spirit of community is living throughout Portland. And we just want, we miss it. And every time I have an opportunity, I want to give it to somebody. And if I've given any of it to you tonight, I'm a happy man.
Well said. Well, thank you very much. Adair, Faye Burch, Ronnie Hartley, Donna Harris, thank you for coming. And please come up and shake hands with the panelists and introduce yourselves to them.
What was it?